Good morning. Blessings to everybody. Blessed Palm Sunday as we kick off Holy Week today. It's quite we we got quite the schedule today. Of course, we're celebrating Palm Sunday, starting Holy Week, and then we're also doing confirmation and a welcome of new members. So, quite the exciting day today. Anyhow, as we begin, I'll go ahead and we'll wrap up what we were our previous section with same-sex attraction, and then we're going to move into race relations. All right, so let's go ahead and begin with prayer. And gracious Heavenly Father, we ask that you would bless our time together as we come together, that you would fill us with your wisdom so that we may navigate our way through this culture of ours. In your Son's name we pray. Amen. All right, so relationships. We've been talking about a little bit about Matthew Roiger's book, Sexual Morality in a Christless World, where he's examining Roman society and how it looked. And pardon me as I keep messing with my microphone here. It keeps wanting to move around. As he notes that the Christians of every age do have an important advantage over a sexually hedonistic and permissive culture, and that is compassion. As Rome demonstrated, a product of sexual hedonism is the objectification of human beings. The lust of Caesars left a trail of death, destruction, and broken lives. Christians answered this cruelty with love and care for others, even for their enemies. And I made this comment last week that when I read Paul Meyer's Flames of Rome novel, in some ways you felt like he had to be exaggerating when he was talking about some of the very hedonistic parties that would happen. And as I was reading Roiger's book, where he is using original sources, so he's looking at their poetry, he's looking at letters that were written, all these different things, and I'm realizing, if anything, Paul Meyer Disneyfied Rome. He really stripped of some of its edge, and I think that's partly because he wanted to keep his book as close to PG as possible, maybe PG-13, as he's getting into some topics I know, most parents don't want their kids reading, and so it really does highlight his statement there with the objectification of human beings. People were treated as objects. Guys, wealthy men would go to the gymnasiums, which is where prepubescent and pubescent boys would be sent for their education, and they would sit there and they would bid on boys to be their next personal slave. They had a whole issue where it was actually considered degrading to love a woman. And to the point, one of the Caesars actually made a royal decree that the men had to produce an heir as the problems that they are having. And we see a lot of that now corresponding with the research that popular society doesn't want to acknowledge, and what is the fallout, the sociological and other issues of pornography in our culture, where it created a very systemic issue of people treating others as objects for the purpose of their sexual pleasure. And so there's been a massive increase of reporting of women dealing with things that make them very uncomfortable. And just recently, there was an article in can't remember if it was the Times. It was one of the big media publications where they were exploring the fact that consent is not enough. And of course, as I'm reading the article, it's like I'm sitting there going, this person has rediscovered marriage, and that there has to be more than just simple consent, because consent doesn't always make things right. It's not something that can operate on its own, which is what society has been teaching now for probably about the last decade or so. It became even more prevalent with the Me Too movement that happened a few years back, where, had to have the positive affirmative consent. So yeah, because I can remember back when I was in college, the A&M health department would talk about no means no, and then they moved from no means no to the person has to actually say yes, and so they're finally realizing, okay, that just saying yes doesn't really make things right, and I was like, that's what I've been trying to tell you now for the past decade or so. But it kind of also illustrates one of the points that I've been making in other parts of our study, where a lot of it, we just have to let society figure out that they're going to get burned. And that's going to be one of those hard parts is, yeah, we know these things are wrong, and we keep trying to tell them, but for most people, they're just going to have to discover it for themselves before they finally realize, yeah, these things burn. They're like the 3-year-old who you told that don't touch the pot because the pot is hot, and they had to go and touch the pot to find out for themselves that it's hot. And so that's kind of what we're starting to see a little bit. And the other part of Roiger's statement here is, if you're having compassion on somebody, you can't see them as an object, because compassion requires seeing them as a fellow human being. To have compassion, you have to actually recognize their pain as real. And you have to recognize them as real. You have to recognize them as one of yourself, a brother, a sister, family members, just all of that. And that's something that is being lost in our hypersexualized society. Yeah, and that was actually a part of this article that I was reading, and that the person stated, really, for sex to be good, there has to be unselfishness involved. And what we've been teaching in our society is basically selfish. Yeah, mutually selfish is good, and as we're learning the hard way, no, it's not. But anyhow, so we're going to continue on, and with some stuff from Ed Shaw. He's the pastor over in England. He does Living Out, I think is the name of his ministry. It's a theologically conservative ministry to people with same-sex attraction. So they uphold, the morality of the Sixth Commandment, and that it applies across the board. And his book that that I recommend is Same-Sex Attraction in the Church, the Surprising Plausibility of the Celibate Life. And Ed Shaw himself does deal with same-sex attraction, and so he's speaking from his own experiences here. And he writes, interestingly, I don't feel that it is God who is preventing me from having intimate relationships. Instead, they are closed off to me by our society and sexualized culture. The world in which we live cannot cope with intimate relationships that aren't sexual. I talked about this before, particularly with the idea of, it just seems to be anymore that guys just can't be friends. And folks who are involved in any sort of fandoms will know that one. And that it's become a thing then. Anything that has any sort of intimacy now seems to be sexualized. Yeah, you get that too. People start to suspect it because of our society. It used to be with pastors, we were cautious about going out to dinner or lunch and being one-on-one with a woman, because everybody's going to see one-on-one with a woman. That's a date. Now you have to worry about going out with another guy, because people will be going, that's a date. And rumors can destroy careers, and they can destroy ministries. And so, that's always now in the back of guys, pastors' heads. And so it's just one of those insidious things that's been happening within our culture, and it's hypersexualization. Because we don't leave any room now for close non-sexual relations. And there's a lot of stuff coming out now about the social deprivation of men, because most men do not have close male friends anymore. It's something of a rarity. And if they do have a close male and to male relationship, it's almost always family. There's a small minority now of guys who will report that their best friend is not their wife, and that they have close male friends that they actually spend time with. It is a challenge, because you always have that pastor-parishioner relationship going, even when you're on good, friendly terms with other guys. There are a lot of pastors who don't have close male friends. Yeah. Groups like Doxology, which specializes in pastoral ministry to pastors, encourages trying to form friendships among other pastors. And really, the one time pastors get to let their hair down, so to speak, is at our pastor gatherings. As when we're with the congregation, we're on the clock, and so there's always a certain level of guardedness, which is, I'm not saying it's a bad thing there. It's always good to have solid boundaries, and especially because you're hyper aware of the fact just even the slightest word misspoken can result in significant problems. But and so this has all become amplified, and Shaw is noting this, and it's really notable for him because he does experience that same-sex attraction. So not only is he dealing with societal expectations, he's also dealing with his own temptations, and he has society telling him to act on those temptations. And he's going, no, it would be wrong for me to act on these temptations. And one of the things that I really appreciate out of his book is was his encouragement towards congregations and congregational members to become extended family to folks in his situation. They're particularly folks with same-sex attraction who are really trying to live a celibate and chaste life, or are trying to honor a biblical sexual morality, are going to be on the outs within people of their, I hate to use this, own community, because it does border on hedonistic, if not outright hedonistic. We had one of our speakers at the youth gathering up in Minneapolis was a guy who had lived in Boytown up in Chicago, and he described it. It was pretty wild. And he didn't go into great detail, but it didn't take much of a leap of imagination to realize that he's talking about some wild things. And so to live counter to that puts them on the outs with folks of their own sexual attraction. And that can not be a good thing. There's a lot of gatekeeping. What? Yeah, it does become a lonely existence, and so one of the ways that we operate is we have compassion on folks, and we take them in, and that was something that the early church was noted for, was that compassion and taking in the unwanted people. And it's been kind of in the news recently. There's a pro-life activist group. They would stage what they called rescues, and what it was is they would break into abortion clinics and take the remains of the children who were aborted so that they could have a proper burial. And they would take them home. They would give them names, and then they would bury them in a graveyard with a funeral and everything. And they were recently in the news because this group was contacted by a whistleblower at one of the clinics who gave them evidence of illegal abortions happening. And the police had raided one of the leaders' houses, and they found the remains. And so now she's being charged with improper possession of, such a lovely term, medical waste, and human remains, and a few other things, and they're struggling getting the DC cops to look at the evidence that the whistleblower provided them, and so they're pursuing this woman with charges. And I think she's willing to accept the charges. She's that kind of an activist that she knows that there's going to be a price to pay for her activities. But where was I going with all this? Compassion. But the fact is, she is acting out of compassion for these children. So rather than being, these children aren't, because the way they dispose of them in just a medical waste facility. And that's disturbing. So they're going to take them and have them burned up with, syringes and other biohazards. So, yeah, I know. I was like, that's kind of how it feels. And so, they take the remains and they bury them. I'm not advocating breaking into places because that is against the law, but it's just an illustration of way people, and even today now, are having compassion on the unwanted. Um, uh, we can also think of similar things like something that's going on within our own church with foster families. So those kind of things, and then the early church was noted for that kind of stuff.
Can I give you a scenario that just kind of sum up this previous discussion?
Okay.
One of my dearest friends, her daughter is best friends with a gay man, and
Mm-hmm.
he is celibate,
Yeah.
and they're both Christians. And the young man has come to her and said, does God love me? Would I be able to go to heaven? How would my friend answer?
My best suggestion would just sit down. Let's look at the promises in Scripture. So we can look at what his law says. We can look and we can look at what the gospel message is. So yeah, yeah. But the reason I'm saying that is because it just answering yes. Yeah, okay, that's a little helpful. It's even better to actually look and say, what does God actually say about these things?
Why is there gospel?
Yeah. Why do we say these things?
The church she goes to is very law-based, so she's struggling with should her daughter even be friendly with this young man, and I would guess what you just said, the answer is yes.
Yeah.
Is important as a Christian, and she is doing that. They've been friends for years and
Mm-hmm.
years. And he does not have a boyfriend. He is not in a relationship. And he enjoys the relationship, the intimate friendship he has with her. So she's doing that part of it. But
Yeah.
my friend was struggling with how do I
Yep. And some of
the law on this?
And some of it will have to be fine-tuned. I mean, where exactly does he set? I mean, celibate suggests maybe he does have an idea that it's not right, and so I can go from there. And maybe cover a little bit that's going to reinforce his feelings that it's not right, but also, with the question of can I go to heaven? Well, then we answer that question with, well, here's the good news.
The fact that he asked that, I told her, says that the Holy Spirit is working
Mm-hmm.
within him already,
Yeah.
or he wouldn't even ask that. I mean, he wasn't asking in an accusatory way. Sometimes you can tell the difference.
Yeah, you get the.
Yeah, go ahead and throw that law at me. I'll let you hear
Yeah.
it. So I can tell you what a jerk you are.
Yeah, exactly. And this is one of those cases where it helps when you know the person, and so you can go a little bit. All right, we can reinforce a little bit, and then we can move on to some other things. And even as we're moving on to other things, just reinforce a little bit. I mean, you can even go right to that gospel and say we can look at this, and also at the same time reinforce it. And with the why do we need this? Well, because we can't fulfill these laws. Yeah, it really, there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, it is the same conversation you would have with anybody who's asking that question. You fine tune it to the situation. While much of what I would say would be covered if I was talking with an alcoholic, it's going to be a little bit more fine tuned towards the alcoholism as opposed to who you're sexually attracted to. Though that 9 times out of 10 is going to come up anyways. And normally if you're dealing with one sin, you're going to end up dealing with another sin.
Sounds like you said, everyone needs someone. God created a family for a reason. But if you're a celibate, homosexual, or however you want to look at it, then you don't have that opportunity for a family. And so to fulfill that need, you need a genuine relationship outside of the sexual element.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the compassion part.
Mm-hmm.
Realize they're human. They need somebody.
Yeah.
If they don't have that connection, then what's their option?
Yeah. Exactly. And they really need people who are going to be supportive of them in living a celibate life, because the world is not going to be. I mean, it's not even. It's not even. It's even probably even worse when you would say when you're talking, guys and girls together. I mean, the expectation now is after first date, sometimes even on the first date. And the hookup culture. Julie was reading a book not too long ago where people didn't even realize there was anything different. They're writing, and this person is writing about these people who are feeling burned, but the surprising thing was for her is that these people didn't realize that there can be something different. Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah. The mentality behind the one night stand does not lead to a long term relationship because it's a completely different um, um, outlook. Not necessarily.
We're in a disposable society, so
Yeah.
everything's
Well,
disposable nowadays.
well, that's part of hedonism. Um, Hedonism is essentially consumerism. And consumerism is a disposable mindset. Um, because the idea is not, you don't get something to last, you get something that you want at this moment in time. I, I, I think so. Even just regular objects. So, and I mean objects, not people. So, that were normally things that would have been considered, if it breaks, you fix it. Now, if it breaks, you toss it and get a whole brand new unit. I was absolutely floored when about 6, 8 months ago when Tesla was doing their annual fanboy convention thingy that they do every year when they talk about the stuff that they've been doing as a company, and Elon starts talking about integrating the battery so that it is a part of the frame of the car as opposed to something that is attached to the frame. And I was like, who wants to buy a disposable car? And if I'm going to spend, a Tesla is going to start at 50 grand. If I'm going to buy a Tesla, I want that sucker to last me from now until next eternity. Because that's a lot of. I don't have 50 grand to be throwing around at a car, and when you consider even with the best battery technology that we have right now, that battery is going to be next to useless in 6 to 7 years. You want to be able to replace the battery, and I don't want to have to replace the car to replace the battery. Yeah.
Speaking of Tesla, why don't all four wheels generate electricity to feed the battery all the time? Why would you even need a filling station for an electric car?
Well, that is because physics is against us.
Well, you're going to lose some, yes, but not as much, I would think.
No, it's actually a lot more than you realize.
Really?
Yeah. As much as technology has improved, there's still a long way for us to go. And so, if you're ever curious, there's a really great YouTube channel, Undecided with Matt Farrell, I think that's the guy's name. But if you look for Undecided, you'll probably find him. And when he looks at a lot of the engineering questions and technology questions concerning energy, and he does a great job. I highly recommend him. But we're going to move on because I want to get into race relations today. So, all right. With race relations, we're gonna do what we've been doing here. We're gonna define things, which is really probably one of the most important parts of this actual discussion is defining things, because I think this is a big part of where we're having trouble right now. is the definitions. And then we're going to look at Scripture. Um, we might be looking at catechism. I haven't decided whether or not I'm just going to reiterate the fourth commandment, but we'll get there. And then we'll look at some of the other outside sources. All right, so let's go back, and we're going to ask. We're going to define our terms here because this really is important, and I know this is part of what's causing some of the issues in discussing race relations now. And that's because there are two different definitions people are working with in defining the term racism. Which means we're going to end up talking past each other. There's the more classic definition, which is the one we're going to find in the Oxford Dictionary and their definition, which is prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed at a person or people on the basis of their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is a minority or marginalized. So that's the more classical understanding where you hate somebody because they're a different race. So you have an antagonistic and a negative emotional reaction to the person simply because of what race they belong to. I hate saying the color of their skin because call me a little bit old school on that one. Focusing on the color of a person's skin seems rather dehumanizing, which is going to be part of my own personal struggles with the whole conversation revolving around race right now, because it's so much of it just seems to be reducing down to a person's skin color. And maybe some of my fellow younger set here can back me up on this, but when we were growing up, that was kind of a really frowned upon thing. I mean, to reduce a person to the color of their skin, that was considered racist. And so having grown up with that, when people start asking me to consider a person on the basis of the color of their skin, I'm like, why do you want me to be a racist? Yeah, yeah. So we have this particular definition here, which is based on animus. So hateful, negative, dehumanizing thoughts and actions toward another person on the basis of their racial background. And so we have one that is, it's a definition based in animus. The other definition of racism is going to be highlighted here in Merriam-Webster. It's going to contain that definition, what we would consider the old school definition, and this is probably how I'm going to just refer to it from here on out. The old school definition with where it's based in animus, but it's going to start highlighting the new definition. A belief that race is a fundamental determinant of human traits and capabilities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. So there's your old school racism right there. And then it starts introducing it in the next two sub-definitions, the new definition. The systemic oppression of a racial group to the social, economic, and political advantage of another. A political or social system founded on racism and designed to execute its principles.
That reminds me of, what's her name? Acceptance speech at the Supreme Court. You know, what did she say? She said it's taken us 235 years to get here. You know, so what does that do? In my opinion, that just brings racism all back up again. It's like, really? You could accept it without words like that or comments like that racism up front. That's just my comment.
Well, her point is that it's already up front. She isn't bringing it up. She's
Yeah,
acknowledging what's been true for her.
yeah.
She didn't live that long. Not true for her. You know, it's like,
So we can't talk about the founding fathers ever?
Well,
yeah,
to
but I mean, it's not, you know.
well, to be fair to her, we need to. It's easy for us to think of this in terms of in a Porsche. You know, you turn that wheel and you're going around. That's, it's harder for us to think of it in terms of, say, the Titanic, where we got a big giant ship and a really small rudder. We have approximately 10,000 years of history against us. So turning that corner is going to take a really long time. 235 years, that's a blink of the eye. I mean, even within the context of church history, we're talking that's recent history. And it's even with her 235-year thing, it's whatever. But part of one of the things we have to remember is there's actually still surviving people who know folks who were slaves, and we're what, 2 generations removed from desegregation? 3 now, I think. True. Yeah, Jim. Yeah, Rod. I was going to say Rod Dreher is late Boomer, early Gen X.
Were you in high school?
I mean, so to some extent, it is actually really recent history, and these things take time, and it becomes more noticeable when you're the minority group. And one of the things that can be stated for some of the stuff that's happening for us culturally that we're really starting to really notice and understand is feeling in our face is because active Christians are a minority in this country. While a lot of people still will answer surveys saying that they're Christian, when you start getting into the surveys that really get down into the nitty-gritty details and asking how often are you active in your religion, so how many times are you like going to service and things, people who report 2 or more times a month of being active in their church are a significant minority of our country. And so those people are more likely also, there's correlations here that are going to be going along together, are more likely to be active in Bible studies and studying their Bible, and also more active in actually living according to the faith and all those kind of things. And so when you put all these things together and you put into the fact that we are now a cultural minority, it becomes all the more noticeable that these things are happening. So we can translate some of those thoughts over to, say, somebody who is of an ethnic minority. They're going to notice things a little bit more simply because they are the minority, and the thoughts and actions and things are going to be all the more foreign and seem more in your face. Yeah, Julie.
I know about 10 years ago, I had been a minority religious-wise in a discussion, and some people had gotten upset or whatnot. I'll admit, I was out even, my assumption was it was because of my religion. How could it not be? It obviously was. It was so, and then it turned out later we discussed it, they didn't mean that at all. But I could not think otherwise. It was a very illuminating experience for me that when you're a minority, you cannot get it in a way that when you're the majority, it's invisible to you. And I did feel that was useful. I had one experience, but some people have a lifetime of it, that you can't not know. And that colors everything. And I think that, I mean, it just does. It's something to be taken into account, that it's a different experience.
And so anyhow, back to my point here is now we're dealing with two different definitions and nobody's sitting down bothering to define things. And there's one thing that I learned in theological discussions is the first thing you got to do is nail down your definitions. Because people can use the same word and mean completely different things. If you ever want to see kind of an easy to get a hold of explanation of this, pick up Robert Preuss's book, Justification in Rome. CPH produces it. It's less than $10. You can usually find it on their liquidation sales because it's been in print forever. So you might, spend a couple bucks on it. But what it does is it goes into the definitions of the word justification as used by the Lutheran confessions and those as used by the Roman Curia, so Roman Catholic Church, and illustrates we can say the exact same words and mean two different things. And some of, I think, what's been driving discourse recently, especially since 2020 with all the Black Lives Matters and all the protests and then riots that were breaking out in various areas, where that discussion was really being brought back to the forefront and in your face once again, is we started getting people talking crosswise, where one person was accusing racism and another person was going, but I don't hate black people. Why are you accusing me of racism? And then they're getting mad because now you're accusing me of being the unforgivable sin, basically, because societally speaking, one of the unforgivable sins is racism. And nobody wants to be accused of the unforgivable sin.
Right, I mean, that puts you out of society.
Yeah, because it puts you out of society. Who among us really wants to be thought of as the KKK?
Well, a lot of people forget that it didn't originate here. It was brought here.
Well,
You can go to the Middle East or Africa now and still find it.
which is true, but it doesn't make it right.
No, it's not right. But I mean, they're always looking to blame somebody.
But anyhow, we're actually officially out of time, and we're getting. All right. Somebody asked, can we please talk about what critical race theory is? I'll give you the base definition. It is an academic theory that was created about 40-some years ago when people were noting a few things that had happened in history, like what's called redlining, a few bank practices that were ostensibly racist. These were some practices that were put in place because they wanted to keep supremacy over black people or take advantage of them. And there's a whole bunch of, there are several things in there. And so they developed this theory, which they called critical race theory, which was to examine structures, and in particular legal structures, and ask the question, are these things perpetuating racism? Which is a good question to ask, but it also became critical race theory's flaw because it went from is it perpetuating racism to assuming it does perpetuate racism. And part of the reason I'm going to say this is because of some of the things that I've noticed throughout the years. Is the very things that people are going on about now as being systemically racist, or there's a system that is perpetuating racism, is actually indiscriminate against race. It actually is more economic, socioeconomic in nature. Um, yeah, but but anyhow, but the basics of it was an academic theory that was developed to understand and model systems. And it is kind of the foundation for the new definition of racism, which does not account for animus. Yeah, only the results matter. And so not everything that is being called CRT or critical race theory today is actually critical race theory. And this was, again, it was like trying to shoot a moving rabbit while blindfolded and drunk, and trying to nail down this definition. Because I had to really dig to find these definitions. Because as it was percolating its way out of academic circles into lay circles, it started taking on a whole slew of different things. And most of what people are responding to are actually those whole slew of other different things that people had started attaching to it, which are in themselves problems. But the basics of it was a theory developed to explain a certain phenomenon and then examine other certain phenomenon. So they took a few legitimate examples, and these are legitimate examples that were happening where people were developing specific banking practices so that they could keep the blacks in the right neighborhood. And an Indian tribe who is located in Oklahoma, their tribe, tribal lands happened to be on a huge deposit of oil. And so they started pursuing, and they're going to drill it. And of course, this is going to make the tribe mega rich. Yeah, it was racial superiority to turn the laws that were meant to be good laws and use them in a way to hurt others because of who they were. And it was largely motivated